All right. Well, happy Friday, everyone. David Shephard here, and with Phil Hamilton this week. A number of things in Virginia that have taken place that we're going to want to mention. And of course, the Chinese summit has just concluded, and I think it went pretty well. They rolled out no pun intended, or I don't mean to be snarky, the red carpet. They rolled out the red carpet for them. Just a couple of my views on this. Number one, I was struck by, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, that for Xi, it looks like the number one thing is Taiwan. I think they definitely want to move on Taiwan, and they're trying to make it clear to Trump, hands off on that one. They agreed with Trump on keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, and even offered to put pressure on China, on Iran. So I don't know if anything else will come out of that. The other thing we learned is the name of a Greek historian and general, Thucydides. This is a reference that Xi made to a weaker power or an emerging power overtaking a stronger power, the dominant power. And I think that's the way Xi looks at the relationship of the United States and China. I don't know if you caught that little reference. He called it the Thucydides trap. And we can avoid tensions between the two of us if we just negotiate. There was a book years ago by a guy named Graham Allison, and he's a political scientist, and when I was in college, they made me read his stuff. And he wrote this book about the Chinese-American relationship and avoiding this trap of Thucydides. So anyway, that was a reference that Xi made. So Xi, like me, I had to read Allison, and I guess Chairman Xi had to as well.
Yeah.
But what I would say with that assumption, I don't believe it's true. I think China's rise is because we allowed it to rise, and we certainly have ways to check them. But anyway, those were the two things that I took out of this. Xi's sort of perception of China as the emerging power, and his desire for conquest with Taiwan.
You mentioned Iran and that the things you mentioned about the Strait of Hormuz and this, that, and the other. But the other thing that apparently he made an agreement on that he would not arm Iran. He wouldn't send them weapons and things of that nature. Which, I mean, I think the summit did go along well. And I know that that's China's goal, to be the emerging world power, and that the United States will basically be subservient to them. I'm not sure that the Chinese economy or the Chinese military can hold a candle to the U.S. I think that she was probably a little bit surprised at how strong the military of the U.S. was with the Maduro arrest. And I think they were surprised at the power that the United States imposed on Iran, under that temporary 3 or 4 week barrage that they went under. But I think it's always better when the two are talking and working together. We'll see what happens. It's funny, David. Back in my freshman year of college, I took a public speaking class. And so for the final exam, you had to give a persuasive speech, I think of 3 minutes or something like that. And my topic was China. Back in 1971, the big boogeyman was still the Soviet Union. And that was all the talk. And my perspective was, well, you got to keep an eye on Russia. But Russia doesn't want, mutually destructive behavior from either one of us. But that China was the one we better watch out for. Because the one thing that China had more than anybody else was people. And it was my perspective that if they decided they could run just battalion after battalion after battalion of people until they eventually overran you. In fact, remember, this was 71 before we had anywhere near the technology for weapons that we have today. But I've always thought that China was the one we better be watching out for. 2 years later then was when Nixon went to China and opened China. And then later when the U.S. allowed China to enter the World Trade Organization. That was probably when we had our finger in the dike and we pulled it out, and then China just came barging through. So hopefully the summit went as well as it's being reported. Time will tell, and hopefully they got some nice trade deals worked out between the both of them that will benefit China, that will benefit the United States. I think they got them to do more purchase of farm products, which will certainly help our farmers. And if you remember before, Trump got one done just before he left office, and Biden never enforced it. I think now with Trump having at least, little under 3 years left to go, at least it'll be enforced for 3 years, and hopefully his successor will continue to enforce it, and we'll start to see some benefits from that trade deal. But all in all, I thought that was a good trip. Highlight, I guess, of it was that Trump inviting Xi to come to Washington, D.C.
I vividly remember hearing a debate around 2000 between two people over China, both conservatives, but one claiming China could be reformed in a sense and moderate by being brought into the World Trade System, and the other saying, no, they're not going to change. I tend to think more with the latter. I don't think
they're not going to change, no.
It's still a horrible regime. The United States is in a stronger position because think of all the oil that China's going to need coming out of the Persian Gulf. So,
well, and China's part of the agreement was China's going to start buying some oil from the U.S.
A couple stories I would like to point to, and we're based here in Virginia, and I'm in Fairfax County, so it was nice to see Steve Descano, our George Soros-backed Commonwealth attorney, on the hot seat. Miaras was next to him, spelling out some of the bad things he's done. Steve Descano, I forgot when he was first elected, but he was, like I said, a Soros-backed prosecutor. He has been giving out deals, especially to illegal aliens, for years, and so he's very, very soft on crime. I liken Descano to a historical figure by the name of Kim Philby. Kim Philby was a British guy, went to Cambridge, became a communist. He went to his local communist official and said, how can I help the party? And they suggested, maybe get a job in government, in the British government, and you can rise up and help us. And that's what happened. Philby got a job in the intelligence services, became the head of the Soviet division at MI5, and he basically gave information to the Soviets for years. I don't know, thousands, hundreds of deaths were caused because of Philby. And Descano, like Philby, decided he could help from the inside. So what Descano, I think, probably at some point decided, I'd like to help the criminal element. How can I do it? I know. Liberal Fairfax County, they'll elect me to become the prosecutor. So you've got a prosecutor that's actually working for the defense. So it's Philby-like in that sense. So Descano was brought up, and they mentioned some of his cases, the easy cases that he had given, and he tried to defend himself. One case dealt with an illegal alien raping a 12 or 13-year-old girl, and somehow Descano charged him with a misdemeanor. I mean, I don't know how you get a misdemeanor for that. Descano had such a sweetheart plea deal that the judge rejected it.
Yeah.
And then Descano, in a huff, or I guess, or because he was so petty, then dropped all the charges against him. And there's another case where an illegal alien, tried to abduct a girl, and I don't think got anything for that. So it was interesting to watch. Also, at the same hearing, in addition to Miaras, was Stacey Kincaid, the sheriff of Fairfax. She's a Democrat, about as bad as Descano, but not quite as bad. But they had her up there, too, on the hot seat. The other thing to point out about the hearings that struck me was Congressman Jordan pointed out some things that Descano said in terms of not prosecuting illegals, or not wanting to, or considering a charging decision taking into account their legal status. So in other words, if they were here illegally and they got prosecuted, that could speed up their deportation, or it could lead to a deportation. So Descano would try to plead down the charge as much as he could. Well, Descano denied that was his policy, and I can understand why he wants to deny it there. But they asked him, well, why is it on your campaign site, your website, your political site? And he brushed it off as, well, that's just the campaign stuff. And what struck me about that is kind of an admission that, well, I just campaigned on that. That doesn't really matter. I'm not sincere, is what he was trying to say, I thought. So that struck me about that one. But did you watch any of the hearings, the Descano hearings?
I did. I saw clips of it, and I saw the exchange between he and Jim Jordan. And I mean, he basically was dissing his constituents, because why would anybody believe that what was on my campaign thing Well, I'll tell you how they believe it, because that's what he's done. I mean, they were pointing out specific instances where he was doing exactly what he said he was going to do on his campaign website. And he was saying, well, the campaign website's not policy. Okay, it's not policy. I'll give you that. But you're implementing as policy exactly what you said you were going to do there. The other one that did, and I did hear this, was Stephanie Minter's mother.
Yes.
And her testimony. And that at the point Toscano even apologized to her. Now,
oh, wow.
Apologizing months after the fact, when you've been called before Congress, is nothing but, okay, buddy, she's sitting 2 seats down from you. You would have really been considered a scumbag if you didn't even acknowledge her. So you did what any decent human being would have done right after the murder. You waited until you were in front of Congress to do it. But the case there is, and I believe that was the case where even the police department had said, do not release this person because this person is a threat to society. So it's not like it was almost as if he was saying to the police department, well, look, I'm in charge here and I'll show you. So there were warnings. There were warnings because this guy had picked up like 30 times and he ignored it. So it took, 30 pats on the wrist. Don't do that. Be a good boy. Then he finally stabbed somebody that made national headlines. And I guess he felt, well, I've let this go for about 3 months. Maybe now I should apologize. That was the first I had seen any extensive, footage of Toscano. Boy, you all have really elected one up there in Fairfax. That guy, he's classic. He's classic. And if his lips are moving, he's lying.
Yeah, he is awful. People may wonder outside Fairfax County, how could that happen? When people go to vote, especially in person, and even online, you do this too. That is, they check the Democrat sample ballot. And I pass out Republican ballots, and I got a Democrat over there passing out Democrat ballots. They take the Democrat sample ballot, and they vote all along down the line. Yeah. Most people in Fairfax County wouldn't know who Steve Toscano is. Yeah. Even most voters wouldn't know who he is.
Yeah.
But they ended up voting for him because he's on the blue piece of paper, the blue Democrat sample ballot, and they vote for him. But this way, this gives him some attention. And now people are starting to realize after a couple terms how bad he is. So maybe there's hope. The county is still so bad that he could probably get reelected, but at least now he'll probably have to campaign. I remember the last campaign, we Republicans didn't have a candidate against him, so we backed an independent candidate. But I don't think, what struck me about that campaign? I would go to different events in Fairfax County. I would never see Toscano. I'd never seen him. And he had no campaign presence. I remember seeing Stacey Kincaid. She had a campaign presence. The Republican sheriff and others had campaign presence. But I saw nothing from Toscano. So he had a lot of George Soros money. He was able to get the nomination. And he probably just figured he was going to win anyway. Yeah. Don't be seen. Yeah. Don't be seen. Don't talk to anybody. Yeah. So, but maybe it'll be a little...
The Joe Biden basement strategy.
Yeah. That's the thing with Toscano. He probably wants to just hide and figures just because of partisan advantage, he'd win anyway. Mm-hmm. So why risk it? But now this gives him more attention, and now he's kind of known. I have a friend and someone who watches us from New Mexico who said she saw the hearings. So people are starting to see how bad he is, hopefully. And the sheriff isn't much better, but she's a little bit better probably than Toscano. Mm-hmm. I think Toscano is the one. Well, get rid of both of them, but Toscano especially. Well, why don't we stay in Virginia with some Abby Spanberger news? The Supreme Court decision went with us in terms of shooting down their referendum as illegal and unconstitutional. Their response, Democrats' response, hasn't been too gracious. Jay Jones has decided to try to take this to the U.S. Supreme Court to get it overturned. The thing that strikes me about that is that it's futile, but it's also more indication, I think, that Jay Jones really isn't a very good lawyer. And he doesn't mind wasting taxpayers' money because such an appeal isn't going anywhere. And the other part of it is he's going to have to argue to win that election day is only one day. And he's going to have to push that argument, even though we know that people were voting for 45 days. So the reason he has to do that is he has to claim there's an intervening election. So he has got to be, he's put himself in this position. He's going to have to go argue election day, just one day. But anyway, Abby Spanberger did acknowledge that we're going to go to the old maps for next election and that this is over. Part of that is that I've been hearing that there isn't time anymore, really, to redraw maps or to go through this process. Yeah. There was a lot of attention to this idea floated. I don't know how seriously it was floated, but the New York Times reported about a call between Hakeem Jeffries and Virginia Democrats leaders about what to do, and someone had the idea of getting rid of the state Supreme Court, setting a new mandatory age requirement limit at 54, because that would include the judges, and then they would get new judges and get a hearing again. The thing about that, there's a number of problems with that, but one is there really isn't time, I've heard, that they can't go through another redrawing or anything. One thing before I turn it over to you, though, I do need to mention, and I was wrong about this, the reason probably that the Supreme Court let the election go through before they ruled is that the state asked them to do that. And this Jay Jones, another reason why he's a bad lawyer, he suggested that they kind of had to, and he cited a precedent saying that the Supreme Court rules after the fact, and so they went along with that. So I think that was the reason, and I think Jay Jones's view was, hey, once it gets passed, they're not going to rule against us then. So that's why they wanted the delay. But that delay cost them, what, $70 million?
Well, they spent about that, and Jeffries, I think, was responsible for about $40 million of it. And so I think that's why he's been so involved, is that his caucus is looking at him and said, you know, we've got elections ourselves coming up, and you've gone and spent $40 million of what you've fundraised for us on this thing in Virginia. That, you know, I've told people, former civics students of mine in the 8th grade, if I'd given them a copy of the referendum and a copy of the Virginia Constitution and all the bullet points that went under both of them, they would have been able to figure out in 5 minutes that the Constitution was going to negate the election. And I think, as you pointed out, when they went before the judges and asked the judges not to rule on Judge Hurley's case before the election, but it was the Democrats that went and argued that it should be delayed until afterwards. It wasn't the Republicans. The Republicans didn't want to go through this. They wanted to save the $5 million. But no, the Democrats insisted. And so the Supreme Court gave them, honored them their request. It's one of those things, be careful what you ask for, you might get it. And they did. But you mentioned Jay Jones and his qualifications to be a lawyer. What struck me, because that was the obvious thing, I didn't realize he was such a bad speller.
No, yes,
because in one of the motions, and he was referring to, because this was kind of a Don Scott versus Ryan McDougal as far as the parties in the case. And in referring to Senator Ryan McDougal, he spelt the word senator S-E-N-T-A-T-O-R. So it was like Cent-a-tor. Yeah. Well, that was, you know, say you give him credit for a typo. Well, he had a bunch of typos, because the next one was he misspelled Virginia. He forgot the second I. He spelled it F-I-R-G-N-I-A. Yeah. I mean, so just from an embarrassment standpoint, people that didn't know anything about Virginia beforehand, because that made national news, that the guy couldn't spell the word senator and he couldn't spell his own state, Virginia. Well, then, you know, as you said, that the governor has indicated, no, it's a done deal. We're going to go with the old maps. And the attorney general's pushing forward. He wants to carry it to the United States Supreme Court. So when he files his motion, at the top of it, it's like, this is to the United States Supreme Court. But when he goes down, he's asking for emergency application to the Virginia Supreme Court. And it's like, so you want the Virginia Supreme Court to issue an emergency declaration on the motion, the ruling that they already gave a week ago. So he didn't even know what court he was filing it in. The guy has turned out to be an embarrassment, and I would not disagree with your assessment of his legal ability.
The legal incompetence costs money because remember, this referendum was, I've heard 15 million, but you said, I think it's more like $5 million to conduct this. It was done if he had given good legal advice. Now, I think they still would have gone. I think Democrats still would have gone through with this anyway. They were trying to push their power grab. But, I would think that the Attorney General owes the public a good legal opinion.
Absolutely. And I said from day one, I said, it can't be legal because you don't have the intervening election because of the 45-day early voting period that the Democrats wanted. They were the ones that pushed that. So they, in essence, they could have done it in a time frame, even with the 45 days, if they had done everything in last spring when they were in regular session and done it, and then had all of the things taken care of, all the notices taken care of, had the whole thing done, and let voters know before September 19th that this is what we're going to do. They hadn't even informed the voters that, hey, guess what? Guess at the end of October, we're going to go ahead and pass a constitutional amendment. You owe it to the voters to know that, because then they could have voted against those same legislators. If that had happened, then they might have been able to count the intervening election because the citizens would have had a chance to vote against those legislators, but they didn't. Yeah. I also think that there's something in the Constitution that says constitutional amendments have to be voted on in a general election.
Yeah, I would think so.
This you shouldn't have a special election. And so they screwed the pooch right there too, because they they just violated, and it was the ultimate authority of the kings. Every Democrat that voted for this was a king for the day when they did it. So for all their No Kings rallies, they acted as if they were each individually a king, and the Queen signed off on it.
It just seems to me very irresponsible to amend the Constitution in a special election.
Right.
When nobody in Virginia, we don't vote in April. We don't vote in April. We never have. So if they put it in November when people expect a vote, a general election voter tends to vote, then it would have been different. So I've said, and maybe I'll consider writing this, and if you want to help me on this one, and that is we should have a whole book. I don't think it'd have to be that big of a book, but on this whole power grab and explain all this, what they did, and the steps, because there's so many areas where it was not corrupt, but it was so irresponsible or dishonest, I guess.
I think it was arrogant. It was arrogance. They said, we're in charge, we can do what we want, and the Constitution be damned. They didn't pay any attention to the Virginia Constitution. Not only was there the 40-day early voting period, they also violated the 90-day restriction after they had done the second passage. The Constitution clearly says no votes can be cast for 90 days after the final passage by the General Assembly. That was done January 16th. Boom. That would have carried you to April 16th. They started early voting with the 45 days early on March the 6th. So they were doing it on the front end and the back end. Constitutional violation. So, people would say you can't make this stuff up, which is why you should write that book.
Yeah.
More than that,
so. All right, good. Yeah, I think that could be a good one. And that could kind of explain it in a nutshell. And I think it'd be good.
Well, maybe it could be called the reemergence of Ralph Northam or something. Who knows?
Well, then the other thing is, sticking with Virginia, a couple notes of what Spanberger signed and didn't sign. Well, there was a collective bargaining bill. She ended up vetoing it. One theory is maybe this is a way that she can show sort of a more moderate face. But I think the reason she vetoed it is she always knew it was going to be bad, but it was a matter of implementation. She wanted to delay it until after she left the governor's office. Democrats, State Senator Serval, for example, they wanted to implement it sooner. In other words, before 2030, before she was out of office. Right. And that's why she vetoed it. That's what I think was her
Yeah.
real stumbling block. Now, whether that makes her look more like a moderate, I don't know. But she did veto the
Yeah.
collective bargaining.
My take on the whole thing was she had done such a poor job on her main theme of affordability, and everybody was telling her how much this was going to cost. This was basically an unfunded mandate to localities,
Yeah.
because localities would not have the choice of whether or not to do it if the people came forward and wanted it. And by the people, I mean the public employees, not the voters that would end up paying for it. That they wouldn't have the choice. Currently, we have a local option, and if the local governing body wants to implement collective bargaining, they can. And 8 localities in Virginia have done that. I think 4 of them are up in your neck of the woods: Prince William, Fairfax, probably some of those other interesting localities you live in up there. I know Harrisonburg, Charlottesville, Richmond has done it. Maybe Roanoke, someplace out in the western part of the state. But they've all talked about the additional cost, because city and county attorneys generally are not labor attorneys. So then what you have to go out and hire either labor lawyers to be city employees, or you have to hire a labor law firm that can navigate you through that. So I think it was about, she realized how much it was going to cost, and she already had a bad reputation for her affordability claims. And this was going to make it even more unaffordable for the citizens. I think she might have vetoed it, as that might have been one of the considerations, because I don't disagree with the whole thing about she wanted it to be after she was out, and the legislature wanted it to be after they got past their next election in 2028. So I think all of those things probably went into it, because she talked about that while she still supports collective bargaining, she thinks there needs to be more clarity on how the implementation of it's going to go out, but which was just political talk for, I'm trying to save my backside.
So that I thought was interesting. I didn't know she would veto that. She did sign a gun ban, on they call it assault weapons ban. I'm sort of surprised by that, in a sense that I almost thought she would just let it go through. She wouldn't have to sign it, but I thought she would almost just let it become law. It's already being challenged. It includes common rifles. Are included in this. So we'll see what the court says about it, because they seem to be protected arms. But it was pushed by a state senator in Fairfax whose first name is Saddam Saloon. So Saddam pushed that one, and so she's signed it, not just allow it to go through, but she did put her name to it.
I think the other thing that it does, I mean, I've had a number of gun owners ask me about it, and I said, look, I'm not a gun owner. I don't pay that much attention to it, but I do understand the Second Amendment. I do understand that Congress can pass laws that remove some of this. I don't know that state governments can do that, can change the definition of the federal Constitution. But they were telling me that they can't even transport their gun technically from their house to their automobile. And then if they were driving to the let's say they were driving to the gun range, illegal gun range, that would be in violation of this law. So there were all sorts of little knick-knacky things in there that just basically criminalize anybody that dares to take a gun outside of their house. And that's what others were telling me. I didn't read the legislation, but that's what other gun owners were telling me, as to how restrictive she was making it by signing it. Because, when you say, oh, we ought to ban assault weapons. Well, yeah, okay, that makes some sense, but they don't ever really define what an assault weapon is, because the military is allowed to use assault weapons, because that's what the military does. They assault. They use firearms to assault the enemy. And the AR-15 is the weapon they always talk about, but the AR-15 is not a machine gun. It looks, from someone that's not a gun owner, it looks, oh man, that looks like a dangerous weapon. Well, I can pull the trigger of almost anything, it becomes a dangerous weapon. So it was more about perception, and I don't know that assault weapon was defined by anything other than a weapon with with a magazine that holds more than 15 bullets.
Well,
Okay.
I agree. I'm always just struck by this term assault weapon. Well, a weapon is by definition something to assault
Oh,
someone.
yeah,
So
right.
it just seems odd. But we'll see. I think there's a good chance that it'll get shot down. And I think also it does limit, it has a definition of limiting by magazine 15 bullets or 15 rounds in
Yeah.
those. So I don't know. We have to compare that to the DC v. Heller ruling
Yeah.
from several years ago. So we'll see.
Anthony Scalia wrote that opinion.
Yeah, I've been told that it's being challenged. The other bill that she signed, gun-wise, is a bill to ban guns on campus. She went to UVA to sign it. You know, I must say, I don't mean to be flippant or snarky, but who on earth would think, I'd shoot up my campus, but they now have this law where I can't bring my gun on campus. So it just seems stupid to me. And also, maybe it's dangerous itself, because remember in 2002, we had a shooting at the Appalachian Law School there in Grundy, I think it is. And some students had their guns from hunting in the car, and they came and they subdued the shooter.
Yeah.
So it's like gun-free zones. All it does is attract shooters because they know they'll have an open shot.
Nobody else has one. Yeah.
Yeah. So
If
it's symbolic.
If I was a governor and that legislation and I was inclined to sign it, yeah, it was a tragedy at UVA because 4 people got shot. But if you want to talk about the tragedy in Virginia, you'd have gone to Virginia Tech, where in 2007, 32 people got shot and killed. And I think the 32 included the shooter himself. So, it's like, if you want to make a point, make a point, because those kids had been on a bus ride to some museums in DC, I think, and had come back. So they actually got shot on the bus. Now, the bus was on the campus, so that's just a technicality. But the shooting that took place at Virginia Tech in 2007 took place on the campus, literally, in dorms and classrooms and things of that nature. So, I've always said it's a nice thing to pass. I guess it's feel good. But criminals don't care about the laws that you pass. They're criminals. And unless you eliminate every gun in Virginia, in the country, and even then it might not work, the people that will always have guns are criminals.
Yeah.
And so that in and of itself, most of them have already been felons. So it's illegal for them to have it in the first place. I think it's a feel-good bill. It sounds great. Oh, we're going to prohibit guns on college campuses. Okay, gotcha. Anybody that wants to go crazy will have a gun, will come onto a college campus, and will do the unthinkable because they don't care. And that's
right. So it's just, like I said, symbolic, but so those were a few of her big bills. And we'll see. I don't think they have a budget yet. We're still waiting on getting a budget. So she's floundering. But the collective bargaining thing, the veto, I was a little surprised by that. But think that occasionally she'll have to veto some Democrat stuff. She has to surprise them a little bit to appear to be more independent thinking. Well, and I do think she's going to want to try to find ways that she can appear to be a moderate.
Well, David, because we still have the law on the books about a local option for collective bargaining, this is how she can have it both ways. So she vetoes the mandate, and then she starts going around to the different localities and talking to the local governing bodies and saying, hey, you still got the authority to do this. Why don't you do it? Now, my position has been, while I don't believe in the collective bargaining for public employees, because I think whether you like it or not, public employees are there to serve the public. And that ought to be their first priority. But they've got the local option now. It's already passed into law. I would have strengthened that law by requiring a binding referendum during a general election by that locality before they can implement the local option. The way the law is now, it's the governing body that makes the decision. It ought to be the citizens, because the citizens, if you're going to have this thing, and I wish they didn't have it, but they do, the citizens ought to be given a right to vote on that. Now, some people will say, well, you vote for your representatives and this, that, and the other. Well, yeah, you do. Then maybe collective bargaining needs to be a campaign question at every locality that's even thinking about it. But I think it needs to be stronger. It ought to be a binding referendum at the local level during a general election, no special election stuff. And if the community supports the additional costs that are going to come to the real estate tax rate, and any other local taxes they might want to implement up in your neck of the woods, maybe they would then finally go ahead and implement the 1% income tax that the legislature approved 30-some years ago. And no localities ever implemented it. It was a big thing in Northern Virginia. They wanted it. They wanted the ability to have local option to implement an income tax, a 1% income tax on the citizens. So once the General Assembly gave it to them because it was the local option, none of them implemented it, because then they knew that, well, they're going to call it we're creating a new tax form. We're just not increasing the tax rate. We're implementing a new level of taxation. So, that will be very interesting to see how she plays this. If she starts doing a tour of localities and then advocating for collective bargaining, that way she can say, look, this is the better way to do it. You turn it over to the local governing body. In essence, it becomes an unfunded mandate to the local, but it would be the local officials, not the state mandating an unfunded mandate to them.
Yeah, that's a good thought. I have a column up now. My last column was on court packing, so check that out if you get a chance. And I touched on, I think this is going to soon become a litmus test for all Democrats to come out in favor of court packing, like a Graham Plattner or James Carville this week also came up with that. So they're getting more and more radical. So check out my column on that one. They say in the column that it's really an anomaly. All my life we've had liberal courts.
Yeah.
So now when it becomes conservative, they have a problem with it.
Well, you talk about that, but Trump lost the case on tariffs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
You didn't see him arguing, well, we need to expand the court so I can get some pro-tariff, judges on there. He accepted the decision and is moving on. That's not what Democrats do. When they lose a decision at the Supreme Court, they want to pack it. They want to go to 13. They want to go to 17. They just want to do something to make sure that they always will have control. They want control of every aspect of government. The executive, the judicial, the legislative. They already have the bureaucracy, which I've always called the fourth estate of government. The unelected bureaucracy, because I can remember when I was in Richmond, they would tell you point blank, well, you've only got 60 days, or in a short session, you've only got 45 days. You all do everything that you think you need to do in those time frames, and then when you leave town, we'll decide. You wouldn't believe the number of times that we'd pass a law that would require the bureaucracy to do something. We'd have to come back next year because they found a little loophole, or they chose not to do what we had said to do, and we just had to come back and strengthen it to basically say, you don't have that flexibility to decide what laws you're going to enforce as a bureaucrat. And for a lot of years, they were never challenged. The bureaucracy was never challenged. And there are a lot of good people. I mean, I can tell you the staffs that I work with as a legislator, they were excellent people. But they were the people that were helping us to write the laws. And so they got frustrated with, the agencies and everything else. Because there's only so many ways that you can interpret the English language. Even the scholarly legalese that everything has to be written in. It's the bureaucrats a lot of times do their own thing. And that's not just at the state level. That's at the local level, state level, and federal level. Because I think in a lot of ways, that is the biggest aspect of the swamp. That's the biggest swamp creature in D.C. is the bureaucracy.
Oh, yeah. And they figure out, Elon Musk sadly found that out as well in terms of cutting spending. And, not to run on, but it's like the Supreme Court makes a ruling against schools saying get rid of affirmative action or quotas. I mean, shoot, they probably are still doing it. They just find a different way around it. It's like CRT when the school said, well, we've gotten rid of CRT. They just rename it. Rename it and call it something else. Well, Phil, that sounds good. I think that gives us a lot to think about, and we'll see what else Spanberger does and what other trouble she might get us into. But, well, thanks, and thank you, everybody, for watching. And again, I say this every week, but I know we got new people joining. If you check out my book, and if you'd like a copy, I'd love to send it to you. Just become a paid subscriber, $8 a month, and I'll be happy to send it to you.
Good night.
And have a great one, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody next week. Have a good night, everybody.